Let's have a quick conversation about Form 940 and Schedule R. So we are speaking here about the Schedule R that's pretty specific. So here's an overview I want you to pay attention to. So when you look at Schedule R Form 940, we are speaking about an allocation schedule for aggregate Form 940 filers. So this is a specific sort of niche, if you will. And you can see this is how the form looks like on the screen right now. So you have to put your EIN, the name, also, and the type of filer. So if you were speaking about a certified professional employer organization, a CPEO, or a Section 3504 agent. Now, this is it will take an entire video to explain what a Section 3504 agent is. So we are just going to say that if you have any question regarding this specific categorization, let us know in the comment section, and we'll certainly let you know how to actually understand the whole context here. So you can see that you have different columns. You have a client's employer identification number. You have the state abbreviation, the total wages, tips, and other compensation paid. If you have to mention the FUTA tax, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we are speaking here about the allocation and allocation schedule for aggregate Form 940 filers. This is really important to specify that. The second screenshot I want to show you here is basically a continuation sheet for Schedule R Form 940. So what happens here is that you have to put, again, the EIN, the name, and also the type of filer. But most importantly here, you want to specify whether you are basically you have to really dig a little deeper, and especially in terms of the types of wages. So we're speaking about the types of income that you are actually, I would say, allocating to third parties. Okay, and one thing I want to say here is that, and this is only at the federal level. Remember that there might be some correlation with what you have at the federal level to the state level. So you want to really pay attention to your state obligations also. If you're an employer that actually qualifies for a Schedule R 940. And one thing I want to say also is that when we talk about state tax obligations, in some states, you also have to think about the county or city/county tax obligations. It really depends. For instance, if you are in New York State, you have obligations at the city level, but also at the county level. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. You are going to enjoy today's conversation. So let's really dig a little deeper here. When we talk about the Form 940 Schedule R, we're speaking directly or indirectly, for that matter, about FUTA, right? So Federal Unemployment Tax Return. And so for employers who file Form 940 as part of an aggregated filing, they must also complete Schedule R, allocation schedule for aggregate Form 940 filers. Okay, and so what's the purpose here? Well, the purpose of this form is to determine if an employer is eligible for the credit and to calculate the amount of credit they can claim. And the credit for employer Social Security taxes paid on tips is available to employers who operate establishments where tipping is customary, such as restaurants, and in some cases you have flea markets and so on and so forth. So the credits I'm talking about here, this credits allows employers to claim a portion of the Social Security taxes they pay on employee tips as a credit against the federal tax liability. And so to complete this Schedule R, as an employer, you must gather information about the tips reported by your employees and their Social Security taxes that they paid on those tips. Okay. You also must calculate the applicable credit rate based on the employer's type of business, based on your employer type of business. So this is kind of important. So one thing I want to say here is that bottom line is, by completing the Schedule R, you are able to determine the amount of credit you are eligible for and report it on Form 940, which is basically the employer's annual federal unemployment tax return. Okay, and so this credit reduces the overall tax liability for the employer, providing you with a potential tax savings when you really think about it. So when you think about Form 940 Schedule R that way, you see a lot of benefits. For example, you have FUTA tax credits, which is really good. You also have reduced tax liability. You have avoidance of double taxation. And you also have the encouragements of state unemployment programs. So when we talk about the avoidance of double taxation, the FUTA tax credits basically helps prevent double taxation for employers who are subject to both federal and state unemployment taxes. And this tax actually ensures that employers do not pay both state and federal unemployment taxes on the same wages. This will be really unfair. You would agree with me. You also have a reduced tax liability. So by claiming the FUTA tax credit on Schedule R, as an employer, you can reduce your overall FUTA tax liability, and the credit is calculated based on the amount of state unemployment tax paid, and it can significantly lower the amount owed in federal unemployment taxes. So this is kind of cool. Boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about the Form 940 Schedule R. Let's talk about eligibility here. So when we talk about Schedule R 940, we are speaking about a specific type of employers, okay? And Schedule R is really used by employers who are required to file Form 940, but also have locations in multiple states with different unemployment tax rates. And so you have we have two categories, two main categories that you need to really think about. So employers with multiple locations. So if you are an employer with operations or locations in more than one state and the state unemployment tax rates vary, you may be required to file Schedule R. And the cool thing is that this form helps you allocate the FUTA tax liability among the different states based on the respective state unemployment tax rates. So the cool thing is that you have this sort of diversification here, but also what I was talking about earlier in terms of fiscal optimization, okay? And also Form 940 Schedule R may be applicable to household employers in some cases. So if you are a household employer and you have multiple household employees working in different states, you may also need to file Schedule R to allocate the FUTA tax liability appropriately. And so it's one of those things where you have to see what really works for a specific situation. One thing I want to say here is that it's all about transparency. When we talk about the Schedule R Form 940, it's all about transparency, but also accountability. So what I'm trying to say here is that, of course, you can file this form electronically, which is always better. But if need be, if you have to file the form actually manually, you'll have to have the proper documentation. It's really important. I mean, even if you file the form electronically, you still have to maintain documentation just in case the IRS is asking for paperwork. You want to be able to substantiate basically everything you're saying, okay? And so everything starts with a proper regimen of record keeping. And we are speaking about you being very straightforward in terms of what you account for, how you account for it, and how often you report on what you account for. In other words, you got to have a system in place, a system of controls and processes that allow you to really have the right data, so that when it comes to tax filing, you are in safe hands. Let's talk about the steps you need to follow here when it comes to Form 940 Schedule R. And so what you want to do is you want to follow a pretty straightforward approach here. You want to obtain the necessary forms. It's one of those things where you have to see what really works for you, what doesn't work for you here. And you want to obtain the necessary forms. You want to provide general information. So again, it's all about, when we talk about general information, we are speaking about your business's name, address, and employer identification number, your EIN. So make sure that the information that we're referring to here, this information is accurate and up to date. And you want to actually enter the total compensation subject to RRTA. So here we are speaking about Railroad Retirement Tax Act. And it's one of those things where you have to see what really works for you. But this information, you'll find it in your payroll records. And you want to report the total compensation for each employee who received the compensation subject to RRTA tax during the year, if this actually is applicable to you. And you also want to calculate the RRTA tax credits, because there are situations where you might have to see what really works for you. So and everything happens in the part two. So but this is part two. We are speaking about the part two of Schedule R. So you calculate the credit for the portion of the RRTA tax that exceeds the unemployment tax. And so this calculation involves subtracting the unemployment tax from the RRTA tax. and you want to really see what really works for you. And you also need to determine the credit reduction. So if you were, let's say, if you were subject to the credit reduction in a prior year, you need to determine if the reduction applies again. So you want to follow the instructions provided with the form to determine if the credit reduction applies and calculate the amount accordingly. Okay, and then what you want to do is you want to calculate the allowable credit, and this happens in part 3. So part 3 of a Schedule R, you will calculate the allowable credits. So you need to subtract any credit reduction from the RTA tax credit calculated in part 2. And so when you do this, you are able to have you are able to have flexibility here, because this will give you the allowable credit for the year. Boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We are having a conversation about Form 940 Schedule R. Report the credit on Form 940. So what you want to do here is that you want to transfer the allowable credit amount from like what you calculated earlier from the Schedule R to the appropriate line on Form 940. And so it's very important to make sure that you are following the proper regulations at the time of filing. And so because the rules change every single year, and you also want to review all the information on Form 940 to make sure that everything is accurate, everything is complete, and you want to sign and date the form before submitting it to the IRS. Okay, and please don't forget to retain a copy for your own records. You never know, and so that you are in case you have a future inquiries or you have future audits, whatever, you are able to respond promptly. And so you just submit the form. So you can submit the form electronically. You can submit the form. It really depends. You can do it paper-based. You can do it. Electronically, or in some cases, the IRS has what they call a list of approved e-filers. So you can actually you can log on to the irs.gov and actually connect with an approved e-filer and get everything done automatically. Or you can use the third-party software tool such as H&R Block, such as Jackson Hewitt, such as TaxAct, TaxSlayer, and so on and so forth, to have the proper information here so that you can actually file your Form 940 Schedule R. Just make sure that they have this. They are actually covering this specific type of a form, because this is not like your regular 1040. It is a specific type of tax form. So not all tax software tools actually offer this capability here, and it's one of those things where you have to see what really works for you. And but what we know from experience is that H&R Block and TurboTax, those two are pretty good when it comes to covering the bases that you need. You also have TaxAct. TaxAct is another strong software when it comes to Form 940 Schedule R. But again, double check before doing anything. Let me give you a couple of special considerations when filing Form 940 Schedule R, and it's one of those things where you have to really see what really applies to your situation. For example, when you have multiple establishments, so Schedule R is actually used when an employer has more than one establishment, and let's say it wants to allocate the FUTA tax liability among those establishments. Okay, so but the thing here is that you have to see what situation applies to your context, because you will need to provide the details of each establishment, such as name, address, and employer identification number, along with the allocated wages and tax liabilities. And you also have to think about your EIN and name control. So ensure that you enter the correct EIN and name control for each establishment, especially if you have multiple establishments. And remember that the EIN uniquely identifies each establishment, and the name control should match the name used on the respective establishment's tax return. So when they file, let's say their 1120S, their 1120, or their 1065, that name control should actually match. And you also have allocated wages and tax liability. So Schedule R requires you to allocate both the wages paid and the FUTA tax liability among the different establishments. And the cool thing is that you will need to actually calculate the allocated wages based on the total wages paid by all establishments and the proportionate share of each establishment's wages. So basically you have, it's pretty cool because you have flexibility here. And similarly, the allocated tax liability is calculated based on the total FUTA tax liability and the proportionate share for each establishment. So this is kind of cool in terms of helping you actually get into the proper routine here. You also have to think about the signature and dates. So the Form 940 Schedule R should be signed and dated by an authorized person representing the employer, and the signature affirms that the information provided is true, correct, and complete. And this is kind of cool. Now, there could be cases where you might have to have attachments. So if you are filing Form 940 Schedule R with Form 940, make sure to attach Schedule R to the Form 940 when submitting it to the IRS. And again, as I said a little earlier, you want to keep a copy of the complete filing for your records, okay? And do everything on time. This is kind of important because you need to file Form 940 Schedule R and Form 940 by the due date. And the due date for Form 940 is generally January 31st of the year following the tax year, unless it falls on a weekend or a holiday. So it's one of those things where you have to see what really works for you. I want to talk to you about the filing deadlines here. So filing deadlines, as I just said, you have January 31st of the following year. So this is actually the employer FUTA tax return, and then basically you have to think about February 10th. Now, if you timely deposit all the FUTA tax owed, you have an additional 10 calendar days to file, making the due date February 10th. So in other words, the IRS just wants to make sure that you actually make the deposit in terms of your taxes owed, and this is totally fine. Now, in certain circumstances, you may be eligible for an extension of time to file Form 940. And so to request an extension, you can file Form 8809, application for extension of time to file information returns with the IRS. And but you have to do this before the original due date of Form 940. And so this will grant you an additional 6 months to file, extending the due date to August 31st. Okay. But remember, when you actually extend the timeline to file your return, you still have to make the payments. You still have to make the payments by the due date. And so, but there are some common mistakes that you need to avoid while filing Form 940 Schedule R. Things like incorrect calculations, incorrect identification numbers, for instance. Those are really important elements to think about. Failure to attach supporting documents. This could be an important element to really think about also. Missing or incomplete information. So this is one of those things where you have to see what really works for you. Late filing is another important element. And also failure to reconcile with other forms, and also ignoring updates or changes. So it's one of those things, again, where you have to really make sure that you comply with the latest rules when it comes to Form 940 Schedule R. One thing I want to say also is that when we talk about Form 940 Schedule R, remember that you have to attach supporting documents. I'm speaking here about Form 941, for instance. So employer's quarterly federal tax return and Form W-2. Okay, and you have to do this for each employee. So which means that if you have, let's say, 100 employees, you do the math, you know how many forms you have to attach, and you have to do this is why a lot of employers like to file these forms electronically. That way they can reduce paperwork, they can reduce their carbon imprint if that's something they care about, and over the long run also have their taxes processed real fast. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. Let's quickly do a recap of today's conversation. So I was just talking to you about Form 940 Schedule R. And so I gave you the, let's do a quick recap here. So I gave you the overview, the steps, and now I'm doing the recap. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll speak to you another time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.